Hi, today I'd like to talk about a Think-Aloud study that my group and I conducted about program comprehension. We'll talk a lot about our motivation, our methods, and our results, but if there's one thing I'd like the audience to take away from this talk, it's that correctness-based hand evaluation experiments do not provide a complete picture of program comprehension. In order to understand what this means, we have to understand what correctness-based hand evaluation experiments are, and they are of course, a type of hand evaluation experiment. Hand evaluation experiments are when you show a subject a program and you ask them to step through and evaluate the program as if they were a computer. A correctness-based hand evaluation experiment is one in which you measure the subject's understanding of that program based on whether or not the output that they claim from that program is the same as what a computer would say. The examples we give in this talk are in the C programming language. And so for this example, the way that you would measure the subject's output is by seeing if what they think comes out of the printf statement is what the computer would think comes out of the printf statement. So for this example, a lot of subjects would say that the output is 13, but in actuality, a computer would say the output of this program is 11. And the reason for that is that the printf statement uses %d, which means that the output is in decimal or base 10, but the integer is specified using a leading 0, which means that it's represented in octal or base 8. So effectively, this program is a base 8 to base 10 conversion, but many programmers won't necessarily know that. These types of correctness-based hand evaluation studies formed the basis of 2 other papers that my group conducted, and those papers were primarily investigating what we called confusion, which is when a person and a machine read the same piece of code yet come to different conclusions about its output. And specifically regarding that, we were investigating what we called atoms of confusion, which are the smallest possible piece of code that contain that kind of confusion, that can cause programmers to misunderstand that code. So with those types of atoms of confusion, we were able to identify around 20 different small patterns in code that we believed would regularly confuse programmers. These small patterns in code were sourced from winners of the International Obfuscated C Code contest and were then empirically validated as confusing using these correctness-based hand evaluation experiments. And using these types of experiments, we were able to do a lot of cool things, such as measure exactly how confusing each of these patterns were. And doing that, you are able to do things like rank which patterns are more confusing than others. And we were also able to go and evaluate large open source projects and do things like correlate how frequently these patterns occur relative to how confusing they are. And we found a strong correlation between frequency of use and confusingness. So very infrequently used pieces of code are often more confusing, and very frequently used pieces of code are often less confusing. And so back to the main takeaway that I'd like people to get from this talk, which is what correctness-based hand evaluation experiments do not show. So the main thing that we wanted to research, our main research question was, why do programmers misunderstand atoms of confusion? And in order to answer this question, we knew that we would have to emphasize more understanding than measurement. And so naturally, we reached for qualitative type research. Now, I'd never done this type of research before, but it turns out that there is a model for the way in which we were conducting it, which is called explanatory sequential mixed methods design. It's mixed methods because it involves both quantitative and qualitative studies on the same topic. It's sequential because first you do quantitative work, then you do qualitative. And it's explanatory because first getting quantitative data, you have a lot of rigorous results, but then you can use the qualitative analysis methods to understand why the quantitative happened and really explain it. And the real power in this type of design is that you can look at one phenomenon from 2 separate angles and get a more rich and cohesive understanding of why the underlying things are happening. Specifically, the type of qualitative study we wanted to use was a Think-Aloud study, and this is one in which you get subjects to perform an action using a system while speaking aloud all the thoughts they have as they go along. And so for us, we used the same style experiment that we had in the previous correctness-based hand evaluation experiments, except this time we would show subjects programs not in isolation on a computer in the same way that they would if they were really doing work or doing homework. Instead, this time we printed these out on paper and we had subjects come into the lab. And the reason we did this is so that a researcher could be present as they were working and listen to the subject speak aloud their thoughts and understand what was going on. And so the value of doing this type of think aloud study for a program comprehension task is that we were able to get very clear audio and written transcripts of what the thought process of the subject was. And often it gave us direct answers as to how they were able to understand code and when they made mistakes. Why was it that they made those mistakes? We did this experiment using 26 total snippets of code, but for time reasons, we only showed 8 snippets to each participant. We tried to keep each session under an hour, but then we conducted this for 15 total subjects, 5 of whom were students and 9 of whom were professional C++ programmers of various sorts. The way that the study was conducted was with an emphasis on not divulging too much information to subjects too early on. We tried to get as much information from subjects without interference as possible before engaging in a real dialogue with them. So each snippet was shown one by one to subjects, and when snippets were first shown to subjects, we asked them to evaluate it while thinking aloud. And during this portion of the study, the researcher in the room with the subject tried to make as minimal impact as possible, not speaking up at all, and when prompted to answer a question, they would defer until later on. When the subject was done evaluating a snippet of code, the researcher would go and first ask what the subject's confidence was regarding their answer to that code. So did they believe that they got it right or wrong? And then ask any sort of clarifying question, anything that the researcher might not have understood that the subject had said earlier or that they couldn't hear. And so this process was repeated for all 8 snippets that were given to subjects. And once all 8 snippets were evaluated, then the researcher would go back through one by one through all of the prior snippets and really engage in a two-way discussion with the subject. At this point, the researcher would often begin the discussion by asking the subject, do they have any questions about the code that they were evaluating? And if the subject did have questions about that code, the researcher would try to go deeper into that question and understand what led to the subject asking that question and what information they did have and what information they were missing that they would have needed to answer that on their own. And at that point, then the researcher would answer their question and try to get feedback from the subject about their knowledge about the answer and whether or not it was what they expected or not. So from this, we were able to address our primary research question by developing a taxonomy of all the ways that subjects incorrectly answered these hand evaluations. One type of misunderstanding that we saw, we called unfamiliarity, and it's where subjects come across a construct in the programming language that they've never seen before and do not recognize. And in these cases, it's easy to identify through this type of study because subjects will say that they have no idea what they're looking at, and it will often be correlated with a low confidence in their response. By contrast, there are types of code that are misunderstood, and these are often things that subjects have learned before, have seen before. Often they will know the name of the construct that they're looking at, but won't intimately know the details involved, will have forgotten them, or will have learned them incorrectly, and then when it comes time to evaluate, they will do it slightly wrong. And these are often categorized by high confidence. Having known what they're looking at, subjects will think that they have the right answer, but it's just off by a small misunderstanding. A third way that subjects evaluate questions wrongly is when they see a construct in the C language that they know that they don't know what it does in C, but they've seen similar syntax in other programming languages. And so what they can do is they can use their understanding of other programming language to try to understand what might happen in C. And this type of cross-language inference is often effective because there are many programming languages that have both similar syntax and semantics as C. But it often fails as well because there are many other programming languages which have similar syntax but different semantics from C. And lastly, and perhaps most unsatisfyingly, there's the type of confusion that we call attention-related confusion. And this is unsatisfying because there's often no direct explanation. So there were many times that we had seen a subject step through every statement in a program and correctly describe what the semantics of that statement were, correctly describe what the result of each expression was, yet when it came time to write down the output, they would do so wrongly. And in an extreme example, this even happened one time where a subject verbally told us what the output should be, but then immediately after wrote down a different set of values. And when questioned about it later, they had no recollection of doing that and couldn't explain why they did it. So at this point in our analysis, we were happy because we had come up with a pretty concise explanation of our primary research question. But through the inductive process of qualitative research, we came along something which, in my opinion, might be even more valuable. And those are the realizations of things that we did not expect. So I want to illustrate this with one example of an atom that we tested on subjects. And this atom of confusion is called the operator precedence atom. And it's where we want to understand whether or not programmers know what the relative precedence of different operators are. So much like in arithmetic, in the C programming language, different operators have different evaluation orders. So in the C programming language, logical AND always gets evaluated before logical OR, no matter where it is in the expression, much like multiplication always happens before addition in arithmetic. Another significant thing, if you're not familiar with the C programming language, there are no Boolean literals. There's no false and no true. Instead, false and true values are represented in code with integers. So 0 is always considered false, and every other integer is always considered true. And so based on this, we designed the expression shown above so that depending on how subjects believed it was evaluated, either with and being evaluated first or being evaluated first, it would result in a different outcome. And from that, we can infer whether or not subjects understood the operator precedence of these two operators. What we observed, however, is that there were some cases where subjects were able to correctly evaluate the expression, but using incorrect semantics. So, for example, the subject quoted on the screen believes that and or have the same precedence, but that these expressions are evaluated from left to right. In practice, and or do not have the same precedence, and this one just happens to be evaluated left to right because the and happens to be on the left. Now, this could have easily been avoided had we shown subjects a mirror image of this expression. If the logical or was on the left-hand side and the logical and was on the right-hand side, the misunderstanding that this subject had would have led to an incorrect answer instead of a correct answer. But as it stands, the result of this is that any time that a correctness-based hand evaluation experiment used this expression, which was many times in our prior work, if we don't know why a subject is getting this wrong, it could be due to a misunderstanding of operator precedence, or It could be that they misunderstood the code, but got the expression correct anyway. And we have no way to tell from the data that we collected in those studies. Now, another thing that happened is using the same expression that we talked about before, the operator precedence expression. Some subjects never even got to the point where they were evaluating the and the or. Some subjects simply didn't know that you could use arbitrary integers as Boolean values. So this subject, quoted on the screen, believes that 2 must be false because you could not evaluate 2 as true. And so in this case, even if the subject understood that ands are evaluated before ors, their believing that 2 is false would always lead to the wrong outcome, even if they do understand the phenomenon that we were trying to study. Now, the upshot of this observation is that we can actually define from this a new atom of confusion. We could call this atom of confusion Boolean value of integer, and we could isolate it into its own experiment, and we could test whether or not subjects would confuse something as simple as a single or expression just based on do they know that 2 can be true. The downside is that, much like with the prior error where people were getting questions right without understanding the semantics, in this example, people are getting this expression wrong despite understanding the thing that we were trying to measure. So at the end of the day, we absolutely did find the thing that we were looking for, an explanation of why programmers misunderstand code. But perhaps more importantly, we also learned that correct answers don't necessarily imply understanding, and incorrect answers don't necessarily imply misunderstanding. And this was the thing that really made me value the fact that correctness-based hand evaluation experiments do not provide a complete picture of program comprehension. And I think my recommendation based on this is that quantitative research can be greatly augmented with the use of qualitative research. And in our case, we had designed an entire qualitative study of its own, for its own sake after the fact. But I think there's also a lot of value in conducting very small qualitative pilot studies for quantitative research. So in our case, we learned after the fact that there may be threats to validity to our prior work through this, but with a fraction of the effort, we potentially could have found that out before conducting our quantitative research and used that to perform better quantitative research. And at the end of the day, I think the biggest argument for why qualitative research is valuable is because without it, you really don't know what you don't know. Thank you.